Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Development Charge Stakeholder Subcommittee meeting. Just to remind everybody that the City of Hamilton operates under open and transparent rules, so you may be audio or video recorded at any time during the meeting, so just bring that to your attention. Madam Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda today?
No, Mr. Chair.
I need a motion to approve the agenda as presented. Moved by Councilor Johnson, seconded by Councilor Pearson.
A couple slides regarding the industrial development charge rate and staff's proposed recommendation for that rate quantum. And then Adam will finish off with the next steps in our development charge process. Just a reminder before we get into the actual numbers that the following calculated development charge quantums, they are draft. City of Hamilton staff and our consultants are still in the process of doing some fine-tuning with regards to some of the assumptions regarding the res and non-res splits, benefit to existing, and also making sure that we have accurate costs for all the projects in the background study. We are having weekly meetings with one of our stakeholders, the Hamilton Home Builders Association, with regards to going through the projects that are contained to date in the background study. Based on the numbers that are presented today, any adjustments from those numbers will be documented for if anyone wants those for any information. And also, just as a note, that from 2013, for the year 2013, the construction cost inflation, according to StatsCan, was at 0.4%. So the numbers regarding our current development charge amount, if you go to 2014, July 6th, about $1,000 of that increase is due to inflation. Okay, we'll start off with the residential numbers. And this is regarding our draft number regarding a single detached unit for Hamilton, and excluding any special area charges, GO transit charge, or the education DCs for both school boards. So right now we're looking at a draft number of approximately $35,670 per single detached unit. That would, if there weren't any changes, that would take effect July 6th of this year. Our current DC is at $28,095, and as I said, about $1,000 of that increase is due to the construction cost inflation figure of 0.4%. So we're looking at about a $6,500 increase due to project scope increase, increased costs, and a number of new projects also, including the development charges background study. Regarding the next slide, regarding the non-residential development charge quantum for commercial, office, and industrial development charges on a per square foot basis. The fully calculated rate currently is at $16.16, and our preliminary draft number that would increase to $19.65 a square foot. Adam will go through this, but the city, for small commercial developers, it does have a phased-in rate. And I think it's over and above 10,000 square feet that you don't hit that full $16.16. And with regards to the industrial development charge rate, currently we charge $9.60, which is approximately half of the draft calculated rate. In the next slide, we're just going to go through a brief history of our industrial development charge. And this is regarding the policy rate that we have rather than the full calculated rate, and what has happened to that industrial development charge since 1999. As you can see, the City of Hamilton in 1999 had a 0 rate for industrial development charges. We did put in a rate starting in 2004, and it has increased significantly since then. And as you can see, currently in 2013-2014, the rate is at $9.60. And based on discussions with our economic development staff, the City of Hamilton staff are recommending that that rate remain at $9.60, and Neil will talk about the reasons why in later slides. Now, if we look at the individual service on the next slide, if we look at the individual service components for the development charges, and regarding the municipal-wide service, I'll just go through some of the significant changes here. One of the most significant changes is with regards to roads or services related to a highway is the category. And that's increased from $6,137 to $9,000. And most of that increase is due to the most up-to-date calculations regarding the existing projects that are on the books. Tony Sergi's staff has gone through that and updated the costing and the project scope. And there are a number of new projects in there also. Another significant increase, if you go down 4 spots, parking. Where previously we didn't have any growth infrastructure included in there. Now we have a couple new facilities in the West Harbor and the downtown that are proposed for the future. Dollars that we've received from the federal and provincial governments have gone into some new facilities and increasing some the square footage of some existing facilities. And if you go down a couple more spots, administration, and the bulk of that infrastructure included in that category is studies. And I know that right now the City of Hamilton's development charge reserve for administrative studies, it is in a negative number. And the main reason for that is since the last bylaw in 2009, there were a number of new studies that were not planned for, but that needed to be done, and so we put a provision in there. We did a costing of what those increased studies, what they amounted to, and we basically put a provision in there to take care of that, so that we don't have to draw that reserve into a negative position. Now, those were the services, municipal-wide services. The next slide takes a look at the urban area service charges. And if you take a look there, the first item there is stormwater drainage and control services. The cost for that infrastructure has increased, and a significant part of that is just the increase in the land cost from one bylaw period to another. If you look at the next one down, not the next one down, but one at the end, water services, that has also increased significantly, and the bulk of that increase is just due to project. An increase in project costs or project scope. If we go on to the next slide, slide 9, there we have a look at what our proposed rate is and compare it to some of our neighboring municipalities. And that third column there, the proposed rate column, that includes development charge studies in other municipalities where it's a proposed rate also. It hasn't been determined that that's a final rate there. So those numbers might change. For example, if you look at Burlington, their bylaw is currently under appeal, so that rate might change. The same with Guelph, London, and in Brantford. And if you take a look at there, just from a quantum perspective, on that slide, we're just below, we're ahead of Oshawa, what their current rate is, but below Burlington. The next slide just takes a look at some other neighboring municipalities. And if you take a look at there, most of these municipalities are west of the City of Hamilton. As you can see, we are somewhat higher than they are in terms of the residential DC. And then the next slide takes a look at our fully calculated commercial, industrial, institutional rate, and again, it compares it to our neighboring municipalities. And in the third column there, the proposed rate, again, those are rates that are currently being considered but haven't been finally determined yet for those municipalities that have a rate in there. And if you take a look at, other than Burlington, we are the proposed highest rate there in terms of commercial DCs. And the next slide, slide 12, just continues that comparison with some other neighboring municipalities. And Hamilton's proposed rate, again, we are higher than most of the municipalities around us, but we do have, for example, Milton and Burlington, they do have a significantly higher rate than the city of Hamilton, and that's for commercial DCs. Okay, and now Adam's going to talk about, just give us a summary of our existing development charge policies for the city of Hamilton.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
Yep, hang on one second, please.
Yeah, can I just clarify, are we going to wait until the entire presentation to ask questions, or can we ask questions kind of with each section?
That was my plan, otherwise we'll be here all day.
So we're going to go to
Let
the
the
end.
presentation go through, make notes as I am on any specific page if you have
I'm
questions
fine
about,
with
and
that.
then ask them from there.
Just want to clarify, thank you.
Thank you. Adam?
Okay, so I'm going to start off by going through the current non-residential development charge policies that the city has. So first is our industrial development charge rate. Joe provided the slide on it earlier to show the increase over time. So that is a council policy to discount that industrial rate down to the current level of $8.98 per square foot plus the education charge, which brings it to $9.60. For small industrial under 10,000 square feet, as of 2011, a policy was included in the bylaw to charge the greater of 75% of the current industrial rate or $6.65 plus indexing. And so that currently works out to $7.07 a square foot. So it is discounted down for small new industrial developments. We have a stepped rate for new office commercial developments. And it applies once per development, not once per building. We have a lot of smart centers, for instance, nowadays that come in and build individual buildings. That discount's intended to apply once per development, not once for each individual building that they build as part of one development. And with that stepped rate, we charge 50% on the first 5,000 square feet and 75% on 5,000 to 10,000. And then once you go above the 10,000 square feet, the full charge is imposed. For non-industrial expansion, the first 5,000 square feet is exempted. So if somebody comes in, they want to build an addition, attached or unattached, they are given an exemption on that first 5,000 square feet. That only applies to buildings that are in existence as of the date the bylaw comes into effect. So you can't get the stepped industrial or stepped commercial rate on a new development and then get the 5,000 square foot exemption for an addition. It has to be existing as of the date of the bylaw. Public hospitals receive a 50% exemption on their development charges. We also provide hospitals with the option for an interest-free 10-year deferral. Covered sports fields, we exempt the surface and spectator areas. So any private development such as covered soccer fields or private arenas receive an exemption on the playing surface, but items such as washrooms, concessions, dressing rooms, offices are still subject to development charges. Additionally, academic and teaching uses in universities and colleges have an exemption. except for the transit component, which is, I think, 28 cents per square foot, and places of worship. If they are exempt from taxation under the Tax Act, they receive a development charge exemption.
Chair,
Joe?
just want to make a correction there. When I was talking about the stats scan rate of inflation of 0.4%, it's $100, it's not 1,000. I said that, it's $100.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wow.
Sneaking another one in, Joe.
Rounding.
We are a metric. Go ahead, Adam.
Okay, moving on to the existing residential development charge policies that the city has in place. So student residences, they receive a 50% exemption if built by a college, university, or an accredited private school. They also receive any redevelopment credits if they're redeveloping a student residence at 100% of the level of the credit. For affordable housing, they receive a 100% exemption if they receive funding through an affordable housing program. And so that could be funding from the City Housing Hamilton, or a senior level of government. It excludes a lot of Habitat for Humanity projects, and that's why we've seen Habitat for Humanity come forward to council individually on a case-by-case basis. Redevelopment of existing residential facilities, or existing residential to residential facilities. We provide a 50% exemption within the existing building envelope. So this is, for instance, taking a single-family home that's been used as a rooming house. If they are to legally change that into a lodging home, it provides a discount on what the additional development charge cost is. So it's something that could help reduce the burden or cost of legalizing rooming houses. And then farm help houses. So they're considered an agricultural farming use. This doesn't include a single detached unit that's on agricultural land, just those that are meant for the farming. Some other development charge bylaw policies that aren't restrictive to either residential or non-residential. We have the adaptive reuse of protected heritage properties. This was included in a 2012 bylaw amendment. The largest impact this has had is on heritage properties whose previous use would have been exempt from development charges, such as former schools or churches. On other protected heritage properties, redevelopment credits exist, so the impact of the exemption is somewhat more limited, since it only applies within the existing building envelope. For erase redevelopment grants, they can be used in addition to demolition or redevelopment credits. The erase grant, as you are probably well aware, it can be used to reduce development charges, or they can get property tax rebates through the erase program. They have the choice of one or the other. Bona fide farming and agricultural uses are exempt from development charges. Commercial greenhouses are still subject to development charges at the industrial rate. The downtown Hamilton SEPA is 90% exempt, plus there is a dollar-for-dollar exemption for voluntary contributions to the Downtown Public Art Reserve. And deferral agreements, the city makes them available to multi-residential developments, residential facilities, and non-residential developments. So in most cases, that is a 5-year deferral. There's a $750 application fee, and the city charges interest based on the city's 5-year borrowing rate plus 0.25%. Any unpaid amounts on those deferral agreements can be added to the tax roll. So that's how the city tries to guarantee their collection of those development charge amounts. And then finally, redevelopment and demolition credits. The city provides those credits for a period of 5 years from the date of building permit issuance. So once we go beyond those 5 years, those credits expire and full development charges are required if someone decides to rebuild on the lot. There are a couple of policies that have been approved by council that are apart from the bylaw currently. Those are an industrial demolition credit transfer policy and demolition credit extensions. So for the industrial demolition credit transfer policy, it was intended to assist in brownfield redevelopment, allowing a one-time transfer for up to 50% of the value of the demo credit. The original site had to be a bona fide employment brownfield, and transferred credits can only be used for industrial or employment land development as determined by the Director of Planning. The credits would expire 5 years from the date of transfer. Existing site must have demolition and remediation complete and a draft plan or site plan before a transfer could take place. And an agreement detailing the applicable credits required would have to be registered on title of the receiving lands. This policy was implemented in 2013. It has not been used to date. There was some interest from at least one site for a policy like this, but there hasn't been uptake to this point. For the demolition credit extensions, authority has been delegated to the General Manager of Finance and Corporate Services and Planning and Economic Development to extend demolition credits for developments occurring outside the urban boundary and for developments that have incurred significant delays that were outside the responsibility of the developer. So cases where they haven't been able to move forward with the development due to OMB appeals or something that has gone beyond their control. Council provided the authority for that to be done at the staff level where staff felt it was appropriate. Otherwise, if staff don't feel it's appropriate or if it falls within or outside of these two reasons, if someone wanted to request an extension, it would have to come to council.
With regards to the white paper attachment that you all have in front of you, staff, we're in the process right now, Tony Sergi's group, looking at some small-scale intensification projects, for example, in the downtown, and we are going to add onto this white paper what would be the cost impacts and some of the servicing impacts of intensifying some of the smaller pockets. In staff's discussion, staff are going to recommend endorsing the principle of limiting the use of special area charges, and this was something that council approved in both the 2004 and the 2009 development charge bylaw reports. And I've got the numbers here in front of you. And also in the white paper, our consultant will expand, for example, in terms of those the two areas mentioned here, Orillia and Guelph, where intensification, there were significant costs in terms of trying to intensify in those areas. And now I'll turn it over to Neil.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My concern primarily is about regards to industrial theses and their ability to compete. Hamilton resides in an unenviable position between the GTA and southwestern Ontario, with the former having higher DCs and higher land prices, and the latter having lower DCs and lower land prices, or no DCs at all. What you can see here is what we try to do is calculate an all-in cost in terms of the location cost. And as you can see, the only municipality higher than us is Burlington GTA municipality, and all the remainder, which are to our southwest with the exception of Ottawa and Waterloo and Guelph, are lower. So unlike commercial, industrial plant locations are not as market driven as commercial. I know for the large retailers like Walmart and Home Depot, they require minimum 100,000 person population before they consider relocation. Industrial doesn't have that same demand on population. Obviously, they're servicing industry and they have other issues, but they can be 15 or 20 minutes outside the municipality versus having to be right in that commercial. On the next slide, what you can see, and again, here's my comment about Hamilton being right in the middle, our comparison with our competitive municipalities. Burlington and Waterloo and Guelph, which are not GTA, but pretty close with their proximity to 401, are higher than us. And then you can see Brantford, London, Toronto, and Woodstock, both, all of them significantly lower. Next slide, please. So, with the exception of Milton, which is really only attracted primarily warehousing distribution, they have not seen a lot of manufacturing. There's been little development in industrial development in the GTA. In fact, Hamilton, as of the year 2013, had Mississauga beat for the years 2010 to 2013 in terms of development charges for industrial. In fact, when we look at total building permits to Hamilton compared to Mississauga, we were a little more than $2 billion ahead of them over the last 4 years. So if we go to the next slide. This is, Adam mentioned development charges and the deferral agreement. This is by no means an incentive, but what it is, it helps companies, particularly industrial companies, manage their cash flow better. That lump sum development charge, especially for big users that are in the 100,000 to 200,000 square feet range, that development charge is something that banks do not traditionally like to finance. The deferral allows the construction and the development of the project to go ahead, and then the development charge can be handled 5 years later before the company's in a much better position. But you can take a look here, and all of these companies, all of them fairly large developments, came in right before the increase of from 665 to 898. And this is really one of the drivers of that was obviously to beat the development charge increase. And we saw all these companies take advantage of it. Next slide, please. This is my last slide, and what I wanted to do is I just want to emphasize that there's many factors that go into determining the plant location, exactly why are they going to choose a municipality. And development charges is only one of those factors. But it is more than a coincidence. When you look at the bar graph here on the left-hand side, what you see there is the development charges before the increase in July 13 were 665, and you can see that total industrial permits were 195 million. After the increase, only dropped to 60 million. And where we noticed the real big difference, members of council, Mr. Chairman, is in the number of large permits. Again, looking at the same time frame, and once you can see from July 12 to July 13, when the development charge was 663, 22 of the permits were over $1 million in value. When we look at the same period, July 13 to year to date, only 6 permits were over $1 million. So what we have seen is a decrease in the large developments in the industrial side during that same time frame. And those are my 5 slides.
Thank you.
Okay, and the last part of the presentation just deals with the next steps with regards to some of the deadlines that we have. Staff will continue to meet with any individual stakeholder that wants to ask staff any questions or have any concerns. Our next meeting is on April the 23rd, where we will present, we'll give a draft development charge bylaw report. And as I mentioned in the last meeting, I know that the stakeholder committee members, rather than endorsing recommendations, they provided opinion letters to the public meeting / GIC. Staff will have recommendations for the stakeholder committee to consider. And I don't know how you want to handle that, but we have a number of options with regards to some of the issues that have been presented. And the last slide just has the deadline dates with regards to the notice of public meeting. May the 6th, we will have the proposed bylaws and the background study available to the public, and then the GIC, the public meeting, will be on May the 21st.
Good. Okay, are there any questions? Councilor Partridge, you were the first one.
I was gonna say, it seems like so long ago. Could you, I'll just do this very quickly, I guess, we'll go slide by slide. If you could go back to slide number 5, and then number 6. On slide number 5, is that under 10,000 square feet? Is that what that's referencing?
No, so for example, that's the full calculated rate. You see 1999 current and the draft of the preliminary number is $19.65 per square foot. So currently we have policies where for small commercial developers, if they're expanding or if they just want to build a small shop, where the rate is, it's a phased-in rate. So for example, for the first 5,000 square feet, I think it's 50%. And then for the next 5,000 square feet, it's 75%. So they wouldn't hit the full rate until over and above 10,000 square feet.
All right, and thank you for that, through you, Mr. Chair. If you could go to 6, and then maybe I misunderstood, because on 6, I wrote down that it applied to over 10,000 square feet has a phased in. But what I think I just heard you say is that under the 10,000, the smaller ones, they have phased in over 5 years. Is that correct?
That's just for the commercial/institutional development charge rate. Slide 6 just deals with the industrial development charge.
Industrial. Okay. Yeah, and I guess where my confusion is, and thank you, Councillor Johnson, because back on 5, it does say industrial.
That's the full calculated
The full
industrial rate.
calculated,
But
okay.
council, for competitive reasons, in earlier bylaws, created a policy whereby less than the full calculated rate has been charged to industrial developers.
Okay, thank you. And if you can go to the next slide, please. On slide number 7, if I understand this correctly, then parking was new, and we got an explanation on that, but I'm looking at Provincial Offences Act, and that's also a new charge?
So that would be a small percentage of the POA building where we're going to have to expand. We're going to have to expand it in the old courthouse.
Okay, so that's the new POA. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Slide number 8. And I'm just wondering, on the wastewater facilities, that is the only amount that decreased, and I'm wondering why the decrease on that?
The reason for the decrease is because of the one of the major reasons is staff's approach with regards to the wastewater plant and how it's been split into 2 rehab. There's a rehab portion which is slated to, we're working on that currently as we speak, and then there's an expansion piece which right now isn't, it's not forecast until I think around 2022, 2024. And so we did, in our last background study, we didn't have in there the federal $100 million subsidy, which was just announced recently. And the way the assumptions, staff's assumptions for that project, for the wastewater plant, because we have applied that subsidy, the federal and the provincial $100 million to the rehab portion that's being done now. So we don't have to go out and borrow such significant sums of money that we had in our previous forecast. And that's actually brought the financing charge down significantly. And I know we've had discussions with that, with the Hamilton Halton home builders since that last, in our last bylaw for the wastewater services in 2011. That was one of the appeal items. So that's, in summary, that's why the charge dropped.
All right, and thank you. Through you, Chair, did I just hear you say it's being appealed, though?
In our last, in the 2011 bylaw, it
In
was
the last
appealed,
one.
but that's been settled since then.
Okay, thank you. And on that same slide, Conservation Hamilton, is that also a new calculation?
It is, and I'll let Gary talk about the conservation authority charge.
Yes, if you would, please.
Generally, what we've included in there is, for the most part, studies.
They have to do a lot of studies on the watershed in order to evaluate any applications that come forward. So what they've asked is if we could be included. We've gone through talking to the legal solicitor, and this one right now is under challenge at Halton Region. But we've had discussions. From my perspective, I think what we've included is reasonable. Ends up to be a $44 charge, but as I say, I think these studies are important for them to evaluate the individual developments that come along, so I can see the connectivity directly between the work that they're proposing and the benefit to the individual developments.
And so through you, Chair, that's going to cover the cost of their assessments, their staff time, to review all those studies that need to be done?
It's the studies themselves that they're undertaking.
Oh, okay, got you, doing the studies themselves. Okay, I have a few others, but I'll let others jump in and ask some questions.
Thank you. Councilor Pearson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you everyone for all the information. And Councilor Portage, who's asked a number of the questions, and I really appreciate you going back, doing clarifying that it's $100 is the inflation rate, because I wanted to ask what the percentages would have been, the ballpark. So for all the other ones going up, it's very nominal to say that they're impacted because of the inflation rate.
That's right.
Correct? Okay, that was one of my questions. I just have looking at this Councilor Partridge's raised a number of them. Going back on the conservation authority, when they made presentations at budget deliberations, I remember there were issues, and we all raised that and recommended they meet with you. So this was an ongoing discussion with them and getting them at the table and making sure that we can provide what we need to, correct?
That's correct. We've met a number of times with Chris and his staff.
Excellent, thank you. Sorry, just looking. You mentioned actually, and I'm not sure if you can give that whole presentation. On slide 15, mentioned the downtown Hamilton seek the 90% exempt, plus dollar-for-dollar exemption for voluntary contributions to downtown public art reserve. Is there a cap on that, on the art reserve? Like, I can't remember. I know there was a policy brought in, but how does that work again?
So currently, there's no cap on it. I believe there's actually a report forthcoming in the next month or two that the public art area is working on about the reserve and the different conditions for using the reserve and what type of projects would be included and what the process for engagement of developers and the public in general will be for that time.
So in that report, we'll be looking at the possibility of looking at capping. I'm just concerned that we don't skew that amount. That works out to be detrimental to us if people have a whole bunch of money in a pot that doesn't go into the development
It
charges.
will be in the report that's coming up, Councilor.
Okay, thank you. Then, last one, Neil, on your presentation, if I could. Slide 22, you've given us just a general overview of the effects of the rates in the from last year to July 12 to 13 and 13 to 14. Do you see anything right now as you sit with what's coming in the next few months of applications that we should be concerned about?
Mr. Chair, there's a couple, and one in particular may be fairly large, and I'm going to see what's happening with the leases. It may be just a suggestion, but perhaps the committee can consider capping to the maximum so that we don't discourage the larger investors and larger operations working here at Hamilton location.
Super. And we'll have more discussion on that as we go forward, correct?
Yes.
Any suggestions? Great. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Through the chair, just wanted to make note that in our draft report that we're going to bring before the stakeholders on April the 23rd, we will be including a policy with regards to the downtown SEPA area, and we're looking at a 5% increase plus inflation during the life annually for the life of the bylaw, so that's 5 years. So we've discussed it with staff, and that'll be our proposed recommendation in the draft report. So it'll be a 5% increase to the current rate, so at the end of 5 years, it'll be 25%. and we're going to keep the 10% of that charge will be able to flow into a public art reserve. So we'll have that option. The developer will have that option.
Okay, thank you.
Who's vice chair? I'll take the chair. Someone over here will chair me. Just some quick questions on slide number 4. The calculated charge versus the current charge. So the precursor is everything that we're looking at here is growth related, correct, on this particular slide. So on the airport, what are we talking about when we're dealing with that type of increase at the airport?
So that, I'll let Adam go in more detail. It really is, I think, land purchases in terms of, there are a number of parcels there where staff put in their proposed forecast. And maybe Guy can explain, go into some of those pieces there, but that's what the costs are comprised of.
Yes, sir, if I can quickly add to that. So with the airport, there's been, because of some of the purchases, there's been, start to be an increase in the service standard that we've had. There's also been an increase in land costs that also account for part of that increase in the service standard and what we're able to collect. But all of the costs under airport are associated with land purchases.
So it's growth related and we're buying land. Help me out, Mr. Paparella. What's the justification?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, the airport reserve, as you remember through the AGD exercise for the secondary plan, there was a separate study done in terms of the quantum that was needed for airport expansion itself, and it was designated as airport reserve lands. So there was a strategy set up from 5-6 years ago. I think it was 2006, 2005 when we started it, and we've purchased a number of properties primarily for the runway expansion, but there's a number of properties that are still left over now that would be added to the airport itself in the long term, and those are the ones that are still outstanding and calculating as part of this.
So I'm assuming we have documentation indicating that we need to purchase those lands for
Yes,
the
there was
increasing growth on the airport?
That's correct, sir.
And where are those documents?
There was a background study done. We can provide that to you if you wish. It was part of the AGD background studies. There was a separate one done by an airport consultant that was hired separately for that particular purpose, and that's where that calculation came.
Okay, so we're talking about lands that are specifically going to be added to the city's property?
Correct.
We're not talking about the airport growth district itself?
No, this is strictly for airport expansion, just for the airport itself. In the long term, maintenance of its sustainability and so on. Because there's growth going to happen around it, we wanted to ensure that the airport didn't run out of space in terms of the intervening areas between Mount Hope, for example, on one side, and the AGD on the north side. If you have a map, you can see that it'll be contained. If we don't provide for expansion for the airport, we won't have that land reserved for it to expand. So.
And what are we talking about? I'm sorry to take up on this one, but what are we talking about the expansion of the airport? Ancillary uses of the airport, or actually more runway, more hangars?
The majority of it was for runway expansion. There was also what they call maintenance facilities, like Kelowna's up there, and they do repairs on the airplanes themselves, mechanical and that sort. And then other types of uses that we'd be looking at would be facilities that would be directly related to the airport, like catering facilities, for example, additional parking
Mayor.
Council?
So it would be helpful if we had that report, just so that we can verify, because I would have problems if we're starting to get development charges on land that's not going to be Hamilton's land, that it's going to be sold off. That's not part of the DCs.
As you're aware, we are the landlord, so it is for municipal purposes. It is our airport. We have not sold the airport. It's leased to Airport as the operator, but the city owns the land.
That's what I just said. I would be concerned if we're using growth to purchase lands around the airport growth district that are not directly related to the actual operations of the airport, which we own. So that report would help me. Thank you.
For you, Mr. Chair, I just signed off on the report on 3 of those properties, and they're all on the existing lands of the airport lands itself, so they will be incorporated.
I think people need to speak up, please, because we don't have,
Sorry,
Thank
so
you.
I just signed off on 3 reports. They're all land acquisitions, and their properties abutting Korean airport lands, and they will be absorbed into as part of the airport lands itself.
So,
yes.
and again, I appreciate that, but we need to verify, at least I do, I can't speak for my colleagues, in my mind, that the purchase of those properties, in order for them to be established as a part of the DC, are actually growth related to the airport,
It will be.
not something that we're going to sit on and then sell off at a later date. That's not the purpose of a DC. So if the airport needs additional runway space, that's something that's defensible. It's not defensible if it's not a part of the main operation of the airport. So that's why I need to see those reports. Could be just me, I'm picky. With regards to transit, the increase in transit for growth, so again, this is growth, I'm making the assumption that this is HSR transit growth only. This is not GO Transit, and this is not potential LRT. This is our transit system within our city. That's all it is.
That is correct.
Thank you. The ambulance component. So I guess the challenge is I don't have the report from the chief with regards to the actual demand on the growth side. So the city currently is behind 8 to 10 ambulances in terms of what are required to eliminate code zeros. One would argue a lot of that is growth related, so do we know what is involved with that increase on the DC? How much of an increase in service that's going to be providing to the city?
Adam?
Those details will distribute the list of projects probably in the next week. I can't recall the exact number, but there's a number. The vehicles themselves are ineligible for development charges because they have a useful life of under 7 years. But the equipment within the vehicles exceeds the 7-year limit. So it is included, and I can't remember the number of vehicles that are included in this, but there is a number of vehicles, equipment that's included in the project listing, as well as some additional facility space that's included. So when we send that information out, you get a better idea of the number of vehicles.
So it'll be an ambulance station somewhere in a growth area, I'm just making the assumption, and the additional equipment that's required to man that station. Gary? Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Council?
Going back to the wastewater facilities, I recall the audit committee, when I was the chair of the committee, we had requested that it be a sustainable, and we had to actually come up with the documentations to sort of show how it was a sustainable funding and financing program for it. But then we also looked at phasing it in, and we tried to separate out the growth-related part of it versus the repairs, if I may, to the system. And I know Adi was fundamental in us looking at those numbers and trying to understand exactly what was growth related. So when I'm looking at this number here that goes down, I'm making that assumption that that's as a result of those additional calculations that we did. Mr. Zagarek?
Yeah, through the chair, I think staff identified 2 factors. A is, as Councillor Clark identified, is the change to 2 phases, one being the environmental phase, phase 1, and the second one being the growth-related phase. The second factor is the city was able to secure $100 million of federal funding, and that reduced the gross budget for that project as well. So those 2 factors contributed to that reduction in that rate.
So there was a dispute, I shouldn't say a dispute, we were having a discussion whether or not the money, that's a fair way to describe it. As to whether or not the money from the feds and the province, there would be any recognition of that money on the DC side. So we've come to an agreement, and this is ultimately the result of that.
Through the chair, yes, and we are consistent with that settlement in terms of the approach
Good.
of applying the grant to the gross rather than the net cost.
And that policy will go on an ongoing basis if we get additional money from the province or the feds on other projects. It would be the same type
Yeah,
of thing.
so
if
through
it
the
comes
chair, we would be consistent and apply any grant funding against the gross cost of a project.
Thank you, Mike.
Excellent. See, we are making headway. With regards to the conservation in Hamilton, and I see that Chris is here, if I may, Madam Chair, can you just indicate, so that everyone understands, what the studies that pop up into the conservation area as a result of growth-related new subdivisions that are coming in, so that we have a better understanding of what the challenges that you're facing?
Chris?
They're primarily, through you, Mr. Chairman, they're primarily watershed studies. So where the water's going, what are the flow rates, and what are the constraints on development, what are the impacts going to be downstream as a result of growth. We tried to look at a very logical connection between growth and development for any of the studies that are included. So it's a pared down desire line that is here in front of you. Affecting this rate, and that's considerably pared down compared to the approach that Conservation Halton has taken. We have no real recreation type requirements in here. We did look at trails when they affect the transportation network, and that's very nebulous at this point.
Okay, and then that was going to be my next question. So the appeal that Halton is dealing with right now, I was led to believe it was a significant hit for conservation DCs. So what are they including that we're not including?
Gary?
Through you, Mr. Chair, they're including a lot more development of facilities and such. If I recall, I think the Glen Eden ski area is in there. I think there's a number of interpretive centers throughout the different parks, so there's more physical buildings and such. And then, of course, they do have some studies in there and other elements. So, and I can't recall their charge, but I think it was in the range of $600-800 or
Three something.
is it three something? I don't know.
Just shy of 400, I thought it was, but it was a significant charge. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone around this table understands the different approach that Conservation Hamilton has taken here, and our staff, and I think it's appropriate, without getting into all of the details, but it's not going after everything that they possibly get. It's really what happens when there is growth within the community and what they have to do as a part of exercising their responsibilities, which would include flood. Madam Chair, just a couple more, sorry. Madam Chair, to Neil now, on page 12 of what I've got, page 21 and 22. So we're dealing with industrial DC deferrals. And my questions obviously are not to be taken as disparaging or to be critical in any way. I just need to really have the facts to be able to explain this to the general public. So when I'm looking at item 21, all of these deferral agreements, can you tell me what years they represent? Is it 2013, 2014, 2010 to 2013? Do you think, what's the first year of the first deferral on that?
Madam Chair, the first deferral would have been for Canada Bread, and the last one would have been for Navistar. So there's some period roughly between 2010 and 2013.
3 years, 2010 to 2013. And on item number 22, we're showing July 12th to July 2012 to July 13, 22 permits issued over $1 million, and July 13 to 14, 6 permits over $1 million. Do we have a comparator with the other municipalities?
Yeah.
Do we know if I can get that for you?
It would be helpful to know. I mean, it's problematic for me personally to look at one 12-month period compared to another 12-month period and say that that's the pattern that would continue on from that point. So I would need to understand whether or not there was a real impact, or it could be just the cycle of you know, they're just not able to move forward to a building permit, so it could happen next year. So it would be helpful if we actually saw the number of permits issued in other areas to see whether or not we lost any. Which, the question of capping industrial development charges, I'm not sure who wants to speak to that. How would the capping be? It would be you would cap it at a certain dollar figure, or you would cap it at a certain dollar figure for a certain square footage, or how would a capping actually operate?
Neil?
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair, we haven't actually formulated, but one of the things I've seen is where they put a cap on the maximum number of square footage. But this would be hard to do with some of the large type of users that we get, so we really have to dig into it. It's just trying to keep it to a point that we remain competitive as a municipality.
So if the municipality were to look at trying to lure, solicit, entice, seduce large factories, we could come up with a plan where if it's above 100,000 square feet, for example, it would be capped at a certain dollar figure and nothing above that. Is that what I'm understanding? Neil or Joe or both?
It's a possible option. I haven't had the discussions with Mike yet, but I have, and it's a possibility. I mean, you look at a 20,000 square foot operation, industrial, so at 960 it's 192,000. Now for a 200,000 square foot facility, that's $2 million. And that's a big chunk. And if we go even higher, obviously, 960, that's enough of a factor to make it a premium.
Joe?
We'll come up with a number of options for the April 23rd meeting, and then the stakeholders can discuss and recommend to staff or endorse to the GIC what they feel is appropriate.
Madam Chair, I guess to Gary then, so we've been at this a hell of a lot longer than, I won't say since I've been around, but you've been at it for a while. Can we develop a system where the DCs would be capped for industrial at a certain value, dollar value, which becomes the incentive for them to come to Hamilton? But on the contrary side, what's the risk in terms of the loss of the revenue for the additional services that the city would have to undertake? So if it's 100,000 square feet and they're coming in with 500,000 square foot, an auto factory, I'm trying to understand, there's a significant difference in development charges in there, and what's the actual cost to the city and everything that would be required to allow that facility to come to Hamilton, because we have to try and do that balance physically.
I think in response to the first question, if you're talking about values of the building permits, very difficult to do a DC on evaluation. The school boards do it, but they have mandated legislation on how they do it. It's in your best interest if you're going to do it. You kind of know for certain types of buildings what the construction cost will be, and you can translate that into a square footage. But your bylaw is really constructed on built form. So that's the first one. If you're going to do it, that's why you see a lot of exemptions on the first square footage, 5,000 square feet and 10,000. With respect to what the connectivity is between a discount, so how much we lose, and then what's the cost of actually bringing on the servicing, that may vary depending upon the geography. The most affected is pipes, because if you have to extend out, let's say you have to extend pipes out to the Claphason's Corner Industrial Park, versus up on the mountain where, you've got, the one around Ottawa Street, or I can't remember the name of it. But, those are, you've already got one that's serviced, so it's a past investment, where another one's a future investment, so it depends on how you want to describe that. But you will have to, everybody wants to hook up, will have to use water, so there's water capacity or at least pumping capacity. They'll have to use treatment, so the facilities cost. They'll have to use roads, so that's an incremental. So we could go through and maybe parcel some of the costs on direct and indirect, and maybe make some commentary by industrial area. Then they give you some guidance, but unless we have a concrete example, it makes it really difficult to start putting pen to paper for you.
Councillor?
And I look to my colleagues, I think it would be appropriate for us to at least give staff that direction, and be happy to do that. But there's going to be debates about the incentives by capping it, and it's not a fair debate if we don't actually understand the risk to capping it on the other side. So we need to really thoroughly understand the potential financial return, but what the actual cost to us would be if we were to cap at a certain value. I understand in Red Hill Industrial Park, the sewers are there, so there might be that potential there. But in my mind, I'm looking at the Airport Growth District. That would be a real challenge, given that there's no pipes there yet. So bringing the services up Centennial, shooting them across the mountain and over there, that's going to be a costly endeavor. Someone has to pay it, and my preference would be not taxpayers to pay it. So I think I would like to have that report back, Madam Chair, and I'd be happy to move that direction to look at the capping and look at the cost-benefit analysis.
And that's seconded by Councillor Partridge, and I believe it's either Gary or is it going to be Joe that's going to be...
Gary and Joe are kind of partners in all this stuff.
And Neil will have some, okay.
And Mike gets in there too, so
All right.
that would be very helpful. And that would be the end of my questions. I apologize for taking up so much time.
I think I was next on the list, but Councillor Partridge would like to speak to the motion. She just held second.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Sure.
Yes, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very, very pleased to second this, but I'm wondering as well, when we're looking at capping and you're using that as an incentive, my question through you, would we not also be wise to consider looking at just what are the targeted industries that we're wanting to bring to our city, and perhaps look at the category and attaching an incentive to that. So, we've got a food industry that we're growing, we've got lots of technology, and I'm suggesting that these be private businesses. So, we as a city have identified the different industries that we want to attract. Neil, through you, is that?
That's correct.
Yes. And so, if I could, and I don't know whether that needs to be just a friendly amendment to that motion, just to include that in the direction, that be part of the options that come back, is that we look at doing it that way. I think there's lots of opportunity here. We need to just, kind of look through the lens of what is it that we are trying to do as a city in terms of attracting the large industrial businesses. That gives us some benefit over the other municipalities that are around. We're trying to build that.
And I think we have to, just from my perspective, separate what the political side does in terms of the economic development and luring specific business in versus the technical side of what a DC is. On the DC side, we can't get into usage per se, other than the general classifications that the province has. So, for example, I'd like to see some type of incentive on the greenhouses. They're marked right now as industrial. So, could there be an incentive there, that may be a political decision, but not necessarily a discussion here, because it's an actual use within our DC system. So I don't know how we deal with that, and I'm not sure if Gary's actually had to look at those types of things in other municipalities, but maybe you can give us some advice.
Greenhouses specifically, we've done a number of the studies. They have a tendency to actually have greater coverage on they're 90% coverage generally. If you go down to Leamington or through Chatham-Kent and stuff, they have a lot of the greenhouses. One of the big issues is whether they're actually an agricultural use or whether they're a commercial use. I'd only cite something like Terra Greenhouse, just in Waterdown, for example. I mean, they're really, from my perspective, retail, even though they've got some growing, but they're growing and then they're bringing them in. They're really retail a lot. So if we're going to move into that realm, we'll probably have to come up with a more distinct definition. And Milton has, for example, where they've looked at more of an industrial greenhouse versus a retail greenhouse. But we can work with you on that and develop some. They are discounted a lot of times where municipalities have turned their minds to it. They're not in the Greater Golden Horseshoe though, but these are other areas where down in Chatham and Leamington is where I see those discounts. I know Lincoln, we've had a number of them, don't discount, and I know that Halton and Milton, for example, don't discount, other than what would generally be there to help more industrial type of development. So it'd be your pleasure. I'm happy to work in any direction you wish.
So, Councillor Partridge, is there a specific sector that you're looking at? Can you help us and we'll...
Sure, absolutely. No, and coming back to Neil, I think, we've identified, ECDEP has identified different sectors that we want to go after. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So that's what I'm suggesting. I'm not suggesting greenhouses, I'm suggesting that if we are going to go after pharmaceuticals, for example, if we're going to go after the food industry, if we're going to go after, et cetera. Well, we've identified those. Is that correct, Neil?
That's right, and actually two of them you've mentioned.
Exactly.
Activation labs is one.
Yes.
And making bread, they're the others. And so it's really food, beverage, scientific, and mass manufacturing.
There you go.
So, to that end, can we look at specific DCs for incentives for those? 3 DCs, Gary?
I'll go through first for logic, and I know you hate that, and then I'll come back to your answer.
Oh, I love logic.
When we construct the bylaw, normally it's built form. And so that where we can identify something at the time the building official has this plan, he's got to be able to make a determination if it fits into your category. So generally, that would be difficult unless it's the actual, like Canada Bread or whatever, here is making the application. But you'll find there's some of the industries that will locate within office buildings per se. Maybe they have one floor, or maybe they're part of condominium buildings where they construct large buildings and they take maybe 25% of it as such. Now that doesn't say that we can't do it, but it would have to be some form of delayed payment agreement or rebate type of process if you really want to target that. So then we've got the built form, but then there can be a rebate that goes back in order, and the question will be, who do you want the rebate to? The actual industry that moves in, or do you want the rebate to go to the person who's constructing the building? So those are some things that we would need back, but I'm sure through, if we turn our minds to it diligently, we'd be able to come up with a process that might target what you'd like.
Councillor?
Yes, and thank you for that. And I guess where I'm thinking is a business that actually wants to locate here. They're going to build the building, they're going to locate here. If we have opportunity for someone to rent space or lease space within a building, that's really between the landlord and that company. And so from my perspective, where I'm coming from, and I think, Neil, you get what I'm saying, is attracting those large industries here And we can attach that to the 100,000 square foot, but it's the ones that we've identified, the sectors that we've identified, that we as the city of Hamilton want to attract to our city. And you know, not to muddy the waters by getting involved with the developers and who does the rebate go to. This, Canada Bread is a perfect example, but I know that we're also looking at pharmaceuticals and some others. Is that right, Neil?
That's correct, and I think one of the things we will be looking for is things that are creating new wage jobs.
Exactly. Yes, so we're not looking at warehouses. Yeah.
Correct.
So what I think we might want to do is have Gary look at it, and I think there has to be a distinction between what a development charge does and how we can utilize that on a general basis for industry to come here versus specific industry, and that may not be available through a DC, that may be available through other things, deferrals and things like that, but we don't have the opportunity to split up in industry into 1,000 different parts. So we need to find the right tool, and I agree with what Council Partridge is saying. It's just we want to make sure we have the right incentive that doesn't also create an impression, I use the word impression, of bonusing specific companies.
Well, through you, Mr. Chair, I think there's a couple of things. I think if you're targeting more of the large user who may be the applicant, or we'd have to work on the definition of applicant, whether it's an affidavit or something. But that makes it easier for the bylaw. So far easier to facilitate rather than slicing and dicing individual buildings that may be occupied a year from now or 18 months from now.
Which is not what I was suggesting.
So that's the first one. I think we can do that. And then if on the other side, I guess it depends on what level of incentive and what you're trying to compete becomes important. Do you want to write it off altogether, zero, or 50% reduction? Or I'm not clear where you would want to go. As a guidance, I mean, we did have a comparative calculation that was done, which I think is a good one, which says, well, here's the DC, but there's a lot more to it. What's the land cost that the individual development or manufacturer is going to have to absorb? And it ranges from, in the GTA, I mean, just Burlington's, I think yours in here was $300,000 an acre. Burlington was pegged at $575. If you go all the way across to Richmond Hill, you're talking well over $1 million an acre. But if you're competing against the Guelphs, which may be at $250 or $225, and then outwards, I mean, the price goes. But they may have higher taxes, and they may have higher wastewater rates. So I think the analysis that was in here was very good. And if you want us to be in consideration of Brantford, for example, or Waterloo, then the level of discount for those particular developments would have to put them in a comparable range. I'm not sure if there's something else that gives us competitiveness with food or competitiveness with the pharmaceutical, and maybe we need that additional input.
So if I may then, and this is, maybe it's just me, but when I'm looking at development charges and the motion that we are dealing with right now deals with the capping on industrial. Industrial would actually capture pharmaceutical and all of those different venues. So what the council does in terms of soliciting and concentrating on specific sectors, food, pharmaceutical, whatever the case is not a part of the DC discussion as much as the economic development discussion and the incentives under economic development. And I think if Councillor Partridge and Neil could have that discussion, and we can look at really some out-of-the-box thinking in terms of how you would come up with some incentives, that would really help the council in terms of making decisions on those items. It may include those greenhouses also, because they are captured as industrial in certain areas, so we really are limited in terms of that. But we do need to have that discussion as to, do we want to cap it on a certain dollar value for industrial growth for significant factories, or do we leave it the way it is? And that would proceed. So I look to Councilor Partridge, does that help you in terms of your desire to have those incentives there, to have that under economic development as opposed to DC, or?
Sure, if that would just expedite the process. What I was really looking for from the very beginning was when we were talking about options, and we were talking about directing staff to come back with some options around the capping issue, just for this to be included in that. But if it's better to separate it out, and Neil and I can work on it, but I was really looking for staff to bring it back as part of the options, because I'm hearing there's more than one option. And that would come back at the next meeting. But that's basically what I was looking for. So I'm fine.
I leave it to the committee. I'm having a challenge looking at it from the DC side. Maybe I'm not seeing it correctly.
I'll just leave it as is then. I still have to say.
Okay, super. Okay, the motion is still on the floor. Oh, sorry, Adi?
No, it's fine. Let's finish with the motion.
Thank you. Okay, so the motion, yep, Councilor Johnson?
No, on the motion, I'm still on the speakers list.
Yes. Yes. So, on the motion, all those in favor?
There.
Any opposed? And Adi? What was your, sorry, because I don't want to miss Councilor Johnson, is it on that item or you're on another item?
No, I thought.
You're on a list of questions? Okay, so let's do Councilor Johnson, then come down to you.
Thank you. And that was a great discussion. I appreciate it. But I need to go back now to the presentation, please, if you don't mind. Through you, Chair, to Chris. Chris Fagwin from Hamilton Conservation Authority. You were talking about how this pays for staff to do the studies. Does it not also help staff to review studies that are in place right now? I'm thinking of the Scooby Lands alone, all the work they did working with our staff after all the studies came in and they reviewed them. Is this part of that?
No, not really. It's not review of processes. It's new studies that would be
Okay.
undertaken, a combination of staff and consultants that have specialized skill sets.
Thank you very much. Okay, just wanted to clarify that. If you can go to slide number 13, please. And through you, Chair Guy, I'd also like to see those reports from the airport, please. This was all done prior to my term, and it would be great if I had a handle on those. I just wanted to know through you, Chair, to Gary, why are parking structures 100% exempt?
Policy.
And that policy is because that's how the municipalities of Ontario set it up, or is this just the City of Hamilton's?
It's a chair policy. It's a Hamilton policy, not exemption under the Development Charges Act.
Okay, well, I have some, thank you, through you, Chair, I have some concerns about this because parking structures are done because usually they're growth related. I have some problems. We're always constantly batting back this rain tax all the time. So I'm wondering is why isn't this under the DCs? And is there an appetite to take a look at this? And if you could at least bring back the rationale why it's not in this, I would appreciate it.
Adam, can you provide some history?
Sure, I can try to provide some anyways. So this would be where we've seen this exemption apply in the past, I guess, would be where mainly with parking structures within developments such as within a condo development. A lot of times, or sometimes those are below ground, sometimes they're above ground. I think that parking structures in those cases where they're attached to a condo, it's seen as a garage, it's an accessory use of the residential. If someone's building a residential single detached home, we don't charge a separate development charge based on the size of their garage. So I think that may have been part of the rationale. That exemption's been in the bylaw since at least 2004. So I don't know what all went into it when it first became an
Thank you for that, Anna. And through you, Chair, I would really like to see a motion come forward that the staff take a look at the rationale and bring it back. In my opinion, the parking structures have the same, if not sometimes more so, pressure on the system, because this is why we were looking at rain tax, because it has to go through our wastewater management, it has to be purified and sent back out because of all the runoff from the cars. So I'm just really perplexed why this is completely 100%. I'm not saying that there are, driveways shouldn't be exempt, I get that. But when we're looking at actual parking structures that allow for vehicles, underground or otherwise, it's still a pressure on the system, and this is what I thought DCs were supposed to mitigate. So I hope I can get a second on this to get it come back from staff. And I'm at your...
So secondary.
I'll second it, yes.
Councillor Parker.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
Does the parking structures include paved lots,
That's what I
paved area, parking lots? In terms of your drainage and your runoff, I think that's certainly a big concern in terms of wastewater management. So is a paved lot considered a parking structure?
Adam?
Through the chair, so it would not be considered a parking structure. So under the current bylaw, we charge residential based on dwelling units, and we charge non-residential based on gross floor area, which means it has to have built walls. So if there's a parking lot, there's no walls, it's not a structure, it doesn't have gross floor area as per the definition of the bylaw.
Thank you. Sorry, John, are you? Okay, so through you to staff, in that report, if you don't mind, I'd like to know what the differences are between them, and if there are DCs attached to them, please. That would give me a better understanding, and then I could support what's in front of us, or I can ask council to review. Thank you.
Did you get that out? Councillor Pearson on the same motion, or?
On that, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I appreciate the question, because I was under the impression parking structures are actually built structures. They're not surface parking areas. And I know, I can understand the analogy of the fact that because I have a structure being built in my work accounts, underground parking is being built. So it's technically their garages, as was stated. So I certainly appreciate the report coming back. And what we're encouraging in these being built is less ground land being used for outside parking facilities, which I do support. So hopefully we'll see that report come back, because they are the ones that cause huge problems as far as water and issues, stormwater management. Thank you.
Thank you. And continuing on, sorry, we're going to pass this first.
Anything else on the motion? Okay, all those in favor?
Carrie?
Thank you.
Thank you. Adam, can you go to slide 14, the next one, please? I'm really struggling with the farm help posts. My understanding is that through our real official plan, they're not permitted. And the only way they are permitted is through house trailers, anything portable rather than anything that's permanent. So I'm wondering why that terminology is up there. I think it's really caused a lot of problems up in the rural areas, and I think this is misleading. Does anybody have a clue why that's there?
I think we might want to have a discussion with planning before the next meeting.
Okay, thank you. And also, on that same vein, a home that's being built out in the rural area as opposed out into the urban area, and I'm trying not to be parochial here, but my understanding is part of the DCs in any kind, it is to help offset any of the any new infrastructure we have to build. So, within the wastewater management, within the water treatment and all that, and I totally understand and get that. A house that's being built up in the rural area, are the DCs identical to that being in the urban? So can somebody just tell me what the difference is, please?
Joe?
Okay, so the urban area services, you're not charged for those that are listed in that chart. You're just charged for the municipal-wide services.
So in the rural area, you're charged for the water services?
No, you're not.
Okay, I didn't get that,
No,
sorry.
in the rural area, you have so the DC would be the 28,095 less the 17,650. So you'd be charged the 10,445.
Okay, so if you're in the rural,
You get charged less if you're in the rural area.
okay, that's my thought. Thank you. And if I can just go, sorry, and just through you, Chair, to Neil. Neil, I keep hearing this number flying out there. I just want to get it on record. We have less than 1% vacancy rate for our industrial lands.
No, we have 1.3% industrial building vacancy rate.
Building
Can you
vacancy
speak
rate.
up,
So-
Neil?
Yes, we have a 1.3% industrial building vacancy rate.
So we have 1.3% vacant buildings of all
Industrial
the industrial lands.
And a healthy rate is 6 to 7%.
Okay, thank you. And through you, Chair, on slide number 15, Okay, bona fide farming agricultural uses. You all know that right now we've got something at council that just seems to be batting back and forth. Where does the marijuana growing? Do they go out to their agricultural, do they go into the industrial? If you look at the DCs here and they were to build a facility, would they be charged industrial or agricultural with this right now?
Depends on whether or not you can, for example, do they have a retail outlet in the place itself, or are they just growing things and then shipping them out somewhere else? Right now, that's how we make a distinction in determining whether or not it's classified as industrial or agricultural, unless it's specifically listed in the bylaw where we wanted a category in there because of
So
specific reasons.
it's not based on zoning, it's not based on where they're situated in the city, it's based on the use?
That's how we've been making the determination to date.
Okay, so is this something through you, Chair, to staff, that you need some direction, that we need to go to planning to figure out, because planning at this point in time is deciding whether or not where they go, and if they do go, this is how the route they're going to take.
Planning isn't doing that.
Sorry, not
Planning is saying it could be agricultural and it could be industrial,
Right.
because there's two different potential processes. One may be the growing and drying, and the other side, on the industrial, there could be any number of manufacturing operations dealing with marijuana also. So they're looking at both of them being applicable depending on the use.
Thank you, and through you, Chair, when I asked the question, what would the facility be charged? Would it be charged industrial taxes or agricultural taxes? The gist I was getting was it was going to be industrial taxes. So you don't base this on where it's situated, it's just on the use itself?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and Neil, number 22. And this is further to Councillor Clark's comments on, this is quite a small snapshot. And if I remember right, our building permits in itself, and that included the housing permits, there was an increase in 2011, a decrease in 2012, and then there was an increase in 2013. Do you have anything that goes even further back than just what we're looking at 1 or 2 years? For industrial?
Industrial, we can go beyond, and farther back before 2010 if you'd like.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's it. Thank you very much for going through all this. Thank you. That's it.
Adi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In light of the time, I think I'll be very brief. Just general comments in the beginning, before I get into some specific ones. I trust that any reports that come regarding the AEGD and all that, and any other reports that you're going to circulate, you'll get copies of that. So I don't have to ask you specifically for that.
So anything that the chair requests, it's on behalf of the committee and everyone gets it.
Thank you. I had wanted clarification, and it has to do with the policies. I think slides 13, 14, 15, 16. All of these policies are essentially City of Hamilton policies. They are not mandated by the DC Act. Is that correct? Correct. So, and any exemptions that would be taken as a result of what we've been talking on the industrial capping, etc., would come under specific City of Hamilton policy.
Correct.
And so, help me over here so that everybody understands if there are any DCs that are owing based on the full rate of the DC, would then be paid for from the city's tax levy. So that everybody understands the implications of that. So if you reduce the non-res rate by half or cap it, you have to make up the difference in that.
That's right. Water rates, sewer rates, and property
Yeah.
taxes, or any reserves they have.
Yeah. So I just wanted to bring that, clarify that. One question, and usually, you gave us the amounts for each of these municipal rights services and the details. But what I'm looking for is how you came up with that level of service we usually in an appendix get about now 15, 20 pages worth and a calculation. Is that ready or will we get it at the last minute?
So it is going through some final revision, I think hopefully, probably by the end of the week.
At the end of
We should have it ready to circulate. 'Cause I know that that's something that you need to see the service standards. So you can compare.
Well, yeah, because you're increasing quite a bit of the charges, and it all depends on the level of service. If the service levels increase, we have to look and see how it got up there, and we can talk about all of that stuff. Regarding conservation, Hamilton, we have a philosophical problem with that, and we won't get into that. That is done. But I would like to know, Chris, you mentioned you have your sub-watershed studies, etc. Could we have a listing of how you came up with this rate of $44?
It'll be in the sheets that you'll get.
Or you
All the studies and such will be listed and percentages and stuff like that, like all the other stuff.
Like all the other things, so you will be providing that. Okay. I think most of the questions that I have already been covered in there, so I'm not going to go into any more details. I had that issue about that SEPA. I had the same concern that one of the councillors had. How do you cap it and what is the impact of that? So I just want to reiterate that because if you put that towards a downtown public art reserve, what goes into the DC fund? Has that been determined?
The way it's worked to date is if it goes in, you've got the option
Okay.
of putting in, if it goes into an art reserve, the DC reserve gets nothing.
But you can't do that.
We would count that in our total exemptions. So
Yeah.
if it goes into one instead of into the downtown public art instead of the DC, it's included in our exemptions.
So then the city would compensate the DC fund of that same equivalent amount?
We currently don't do that, but if we had the additional tax support.
They don't.
We don't fund exemptions
It's not an
other than,
allocation issue, so if it goes into the public art side and it becomes in essence an exemption, then that cost becomes a part of the overall municipal levy. That's how the city would have that funding through the general revenue, so it wouldn't be automatically just added to the next round of DC discussion.
Yeah, but it would be a city share of whatever
Correct, it would
projects
be a
that
city
you
share,
are.
not city, correct.
It would be it would be levy funded.
It would be leveled, funded by the levy.
Correct.
So, well, I have a hard time. Why do you provide that voluntary contribution? But I will leave that up to you.
And it may not happen.
Because you are therefore telling the rest of the city is going to pay for that.
And that's why I raised the issue on the industrial capping, because in my mind, in my understanding of DCs, if we turn around and cap a DC on a 150,000 square foot property, and there's still that value of services that are required above that 150,000 square foot property, that just simply can't be taken out of everyone else's DC money. It has to come off of the levy then. Once you exempt it, it's no longer being funded from the DCs, and that's why I asked about the actual costing. So you're correct, Nadia, we have to be very careful, because if you're doing an exemption on one side, what you're really, it's not just free money, it's now money coming from the taxpayer.
Right. And you've got to account for it.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so is the value really worth that exemption? And we don't know, but we have to have that discussion. Joe?
so for example, on the water, sewer, storm side, the rate budget for the city of Hamilton has funded the exemptions to the tune of approximately $9 million a year. Since we've instituted that policy that the rate budget funds the exemptions. Just on the tax supported side, we don't have that capacity, so projects don't get done.
But it just don't get done.
Well, for example, the urbanization of Upper Sherman and some of the other streets are still not completed because we have to find room in the tax supported budget before we fund them.
So they stay on the DC project list until you build it, and that may be a few years from now.
Anything else, Adi?
No, I'll stop it over there. Thank you very much.
No, I mean, excellent discussion, and these, I mean, we could be here all day having those debates. And
Exactly, yes.
that's why it has to be very public, so the public is aware of the decisions and the implications of the decisions. The comments on conservation, I'm fine with this is me speaking personally, the philosophy of us paying for the conservation DC, because the Conservation Authority gets money from the Ministry of Natural Resources, their own general revenue from Wild Water Works, and from levies from the municipality. So, and that pays for their ongoing services throughout the year. But when you actually look at their services that they're providing, when they're doing these studies on new subdivisions, there isn't something more specific to growth-related study. It's specific to their impact and what their concerns are on that new subdivision. And to have the levy increase across the way for that new subdivision that wouldn't occur had that developer not decided to proceed with that development, again, it becomes that issue of fairness. So should the levy pay for that, or should the DCs pay for it? And that's, I guess, a part of the discussion that's before the courts right now. But we're just talking about the study side, not everything else that they're doing. I have an issue if they're
And
putting it in there.
we'll defer any more comment on that until I see the list.
Come on, Adi, let's go for it.
Anytime, but we'll wait until.
I'll take my tie off, we're ready, forget about it. Okay, other questions from anyone? Yes, sir. Please give us your name and your organization so everyone knows.
My name is Zafar Saeed, I'm from the Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you.
I just had a quick question to the chair for Mr. Everson. Well, not Mr. Everson, sorry, that's the second question. I don't know if I'm going to get to it. But for staff, you mentioned that for the $100 million for wastewater that you got from the upper government, since infrastructure is a provincial and federal responsibility, and there's pockets of money that parachute in from time to time for the city of Hamilton. Do you have any research or any reports on what are some of the other buckets that are currently under DC that other municipalities have gotten federal or provincial funding for that has allowed the developers to pay lesser development charges, if that makes any sense?
Some of the projects in other municipalities?
Yeah, that we've missed out on as a city, that there is precedent for in other municipalities that have been funded to federal, provincial infrastructure funding.
And we missed out on?
Yeah, that's what I missed out on, that they, for example, City of Burlington is getting provincial federal funding for certain things that will eventually lead to lower development charges. Are there other examples of that Hamilton could have gotten or could be advocated for?
No, we, if I may, we request funding for specific project applications with the federal and provincial government using, for example, the sewer water treatment plant. So that was a specific project, and we can request that any number of times on different projects across the way. Where the DC would be lowered on a project like that is if it can be demonstrated that that project actually has growth inside that project. So a part of the issue for the sewer water treatment plant is we need an increase in capacity on that particular facility. And so that component of the DCs means that those DCs would be lowered appropriately. The part of it, for example, the Ministry of Environment ordered us to repair our sewer treatment facility, and in essence take it to tertiary treatment to prevent impacts into the water and the ongoing issue there. That's not a part of the DC, that's the city's obligation, and so that was not exempted or did not lower DC. So all the municipalities can file for projects from the feds and the province, and if there is growth-related costs, then it would ultimately mean a subsequent lowering of portion prorated of the DCs. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just meant indirectly, not
Yep.
directly.
Yep. Okay. Any other questions, sir?
Just the second question is just clarification. So it was mentioned that the downtown Hamilton CIPA, it will be increasing by 5 for the next 5 years. So, right, am I correct in thinking that if it's 90% right now, it'll go to 85 and then 80 and then 75 and then lower?
That's correct, but that's just staff, that'll be staff's recommendation, what
Okay.
council decides upon.
So it's
will be
still
their
on the table.
decision. But right now, in discussions with economic development and finance, that's an option that staff prefer.
And just a follow-up. Could you quickly comment on the rationale for that recommendation or that suggestion?
We're always looking at, economic ways, a balanced approach in terms of trying to bring in more or recapturing more development charges, getting our exemption dollar amount lower. And so in the staff's had discussions, we felt that one was economically viable, and forcing those people have their nose to the ground in terms of what it can support, and that's a decision we came up with.
Mr. Everson?
Just one comment. Those incentives were put in place to stimulate the downtown. And as a result, and there's certainly been enough activity downtown, but I think council's intent, we get that question often, is how long.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, but we do. When we stop the incentives, and our responsible council should tell us, but you just can't cut them off immediately. It has to be weaned down. But, the momentum is there, and I think we can't go on indefinitely without lowering the exemption.
If I may, the council's position is that an incentive no longer becomes an incentive if it becomes a permanent policy. If there isn't a cutoff in the future, if there isn't a perspective of a future cutoff, then it's not an incentive. The developers need to know that it's not going to be there forever, so if they want to do this, they have to do it within a certain period of time, or else they're not going to have that opportunity. Okay? Other questions? John?
John Shivers Wilson, citizen at heart.
Proud to have you here, John.
Thank you very much. On slide 7, I banged for this one. I thought I heard for outdoor and indoor recreation services, you had an increase due to service standard increases. You've got a fairly substantial jump here. But I thought I heard something about monies that are fundings from provincial or federal governments. Was that given or not? Was there any money allotted, or did it come from the province or something, or did I mishear?
On which specific?
On outdoor recreation and indoor recreation services.
Yes, there was. Adam, you can list the individual projects in terms of, there's a Stony Creek Rec Center, I believe, and
Westman.
And they received provincial assistance?
So yeah, a number of those projects were included in the infrastructure stimulus funding that we received in 2009, so both federal and provincial funding.
Yeah, it's just that, in the current calculated charges is, talking 1,000, almost 50%. So I was thinking with the monies that you might have gotten, I don't know, I'm just a citizen. On your administration studies, you've got mainly development charge, You've got new studies planned for, not done. Does that mean, does that not done mean is that they're still in process, they haven't been completed, or that there were planned studies and they just didn't do them?
Adam?
So the project listing that we come up with to figure out what the charges would be, they're all future studies and future costs, plus in some instances they may be studies that are in progress that we haven't yet funded. So anything that has been approved through the capital budget and has been funded, it's not included on the list of future projects, and it wouldn't be part of that charge. Part of the calculation of the charges that you see.
So studies not done would be more appropriate to come, studies to come.
And I have this long-term care, presumably for the elderly. You've got a fairly big jump there. Can someone speak to this? This long-term care?
Adam?
So I can't recall which,
In the past study, the only thing that was identified at that time was the expansion of parking facilities at one of the long-term care facilities. Now there's actually an expansion to one of the facilities itself that is being included in there.
So do we actually have that report to help John and the rest of the committee in terms of what those projected cost implications are? We need to have those background studies.
Yeah, so you'll get the project listing, as we mentioned, by the end of the week.
So we only have 2 long-term care facilities that are within municipal responsibility in Hamilton. So there will be a report on one of them indicating what their projected costs are going to be for the expansion and subsequently what DCs will be required.
I noted that parking facilities was mentioned, and perhaps I might tie it in with something Councilor Johnson was requesting there, in terms of parking structures.
Not tied in with long-term through each year, not through long-term. It was just a general question.
Regarding the structure, the parking structure.
Yeah, we'll get that report to everybody so that we can have it down.
The other final thing was your social housing is up there, but is that just regular inflationary type increases? I mean, social housing is a fairly important component, I think, of well-being of society, so I'm just wondering what kind of costs.
So the DCs on affordable housing historically has been through an affordable housing program. So what's being included there under social housing?
so this is City Housing Hamilton costs for additional units. I believe the cost, the increase is probably due in part to an increase in the service standard. I know they've had a number of units added over the past 5 years. And so that'll be something that you'd be able to see when we get the service standard information circulated. Is over the last 10 years, seeing units come online. As the number of units increase, the service standard that you have generally will increase, and so you can increase the amount that you can collect. The capital project listing for units to be built for City Housing Hamilton is fairly substantial. There is a large benefit to existing due to the existing waiting list, but there is still a component that we attach to that.
Okay, so we need to see that report from City Housing to verify that it's a growth component, if they're actually looking at building new units, because it's not the repair of older units, that can't be covered. And if there's any additional funding coming from senior levels of government, that has to be included in that document also.
Yeah, just in looking at that, in terms of slide 14, you've got affordable housing, 100% exempt of receiving funding from the affordable housing program. So I'm a little...
That's the payment of the development charge by City Hamilton, or City Housing. So if there was a housing authority, like Stony Creek Not-for-Profit Housing, or whichever housing authority is, if they're building a new facility, they're exempt from paying those development charges, but the development charges are still collectible from the overall DC pot, if you will.
Why does Habitat for Humanity get this exemption on a case-by-case basis? What that kind of got me? Why would that be? I mean, aren't they something that's for housing, affordable housing program? Why would they be 100%?
There's no government housing program for Habitat. No, they're an individual organization that runs a very unique program. They actually purchase the land or get the land from the government as a donation. Then they actually set up mortgages for the people that own the property. And so it kind of falls out the bailiwick of the typical not-for-profit housing. So they come before the council and we historically have provided them with the exemption.
Okay. And then my last question, and then I'll go hide.
Excellent questions.
On your slides 19 and 20, your industrial rates, and you've got your comparable competitor municipalities and neighboring municipalities. Anyways, in the comparable competitor municipalities, I noticed somebody was mentioning Mississauga, and my understanding is that's a pretty good growth area in terms of attracting Why isn't that in there as a comparative? Because I'm kind of curious, because I heard Mississauga being mentioned, so I was kind of wondering if that might be a useful, what are they doing right? Or what's happening there that they're attracting businesses and that sort of thing? And that might be a good competitor, comparable, or
So let's deal with,
municipality to inject in this and sort of explore
let's deal with your question from two standpoints. Gary and Joe, if you want to deal with the question from the historical comparators that we're using with their DC studies, and what they are, and then perhaps Neil can deal with how we compare economically with areas that are not within our comparator. So Gary or Joe, do you want to start off?
I guess generally we wanted to stay on the western side of the GTA and take a look at, we're right adjacent to Brantford, we're right against Niagara, and we're at the very far end of the defined GTA. But we did include Milton in some of the comparators and Burlington, obviously. I would put Milton right on the same parallel as Mississauga. And I think the key thing you're seeing there is the transportation corridor all along the 401, and you're feeding with the 403, the 410. You've got everything right in that area, and it seems to be, number one, the primary area for transportation. There's other there's other good areas and such, but I mean, that's the number one hub where everything is coming to. I guess we didn't want to too far go into that area. I mean, we get into Richmond Hill at, East Beaver Creek at, over $1 million an acre. It tends to skew, I think, the analysis a little bit. I mean, we can provide you anything you want, but I think we were a little more akin to really who are your neighbors, who are your direct competitors and such. They have a lot of the same defined elements or benefits or attributes that people would be looking for. So that's why we answered it.
Thank you. And Neil, on the economic development side?
Yeah, we referenced Mississauga because for the last 10 years, Mississauga's been an industrial hub in terms of building permits. But they have the highest industrial development charges, they have the highest land prices, and we wanted to show the comparison of, the difference. So with Mississauga, when you have those high DCs and you have those high land prices, industry looks for alternative locations. And a lot of the activity we've seen has to go in the GTA and the Mississauga area. So we just wanted to show the influence and the impact of those high rates.
John? Supplementary?
Yeah, well, on the basis of that, I just wanted to show that. Again, I guess it's just the biggest question is why it wasn't indicated in your slides 19 and 20. Well, 19 at least anyways. And if they have these high DCs and land prices, why are they doing so well?
Well, the point is that they actually beating the last year.
So let's include Mississauga. And then we can have it in front of everyone, and we know they're a large competitor, we know what's happening there, so let's put it right in front of us all the time.
And the other factor about Mississauga is they're starting to develop it now. So industrial.
To our advantage.
To our advantage.
Okay, John, any other questions?
No,
Excellent. Okay, any other questions, Councillor?
Yeah, I just want to know if I can meet with Guy afterwards. F1 map, this is the big one. I got an email after the last meeting asking why the color coding in one certain area is just very ambiguous, so I'd just like to get some clarification on that, please.
I'm sure Mr. Paparella will come with his colored crayons and help you with the map.
He said you have to do whatever I said.
He wants to meet with you, guys, he wants to meet with you, refer it to a map and the colors on the map, and it was slightly ambiguous, so she needs clarification.
But Tony as well.
Sure.
After the meeting, 5 minutes late.
Sure.
Okay. Folks, we have this discussion paper that was circulated to everyone, so this is the draft discussion paper. There's still some there are some additions that will be added to it. That's being pretty redundant. So we will be dealing with it at a future meeting in terms of a decision, but this is the document from our staff that really starts to justify some of the decisions. So we'll provide the addendums and the changes as we come forward. Okay. Any other questions from anyone before? Yep, this is the draft though. So there'll be some changes to it, but it helps to lead our discussions. And that doesn't mean we necessarily agree with everything that's in there. It's just a discussion document. No further questions. I need a motion to adjourn. Councillor Pearson. A motion to receive all of the reports moved by Councillor Pearson, second by Councillor Johnson. All those in favor? Carried. And a motion to adjourn. Councillor Pearson, Councillor Johnson. All those in favor? Carried. To everyone that's here, thank you. I know it's a long process, but it's important that we go through it.
Tony.
It's getting easier.